Very much, Senator Collins. I thank Senator McCain and Senator Brown for being here, and we'll go to the witnesses now who have been so patient in waiting. First, Congressman Ted Deutch was elected to Congress to fill an open seat last month by the voters of the 19th District of Florida in quite an impressive victory, all the more impressive to those who know because of the fact that he had earlier in his career supported various of my campaigns, and notwithstanding that, he went on to win a great victory. Congressman Deutch is seated as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Judiciary Committee, I think showing the confidence that the leadership has in him. But this morning, we asked him to be here, particularly to share with us lessons from the state Senate in Florida, where he has served and where he led a successful effort to pass legislation requiring the state pension fund to divest from companies doing business in Iran. And I think the process followed there is instructive and encouraging for us at the federal level. Congressman Deutch, congratulations again, and welcome to our committee this morning.
Thank you, Chairman Lieberman, Ranking Member Collins, members of the committee. Appreciate the invitation to join you here today. The Iranian nuclear weapons program poses a grave and growing national security threat to our nation. Risks a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, threatens our allies in Europe and beyond, and poses an existential threat to our critical ally Israel. I'm grateful that the House and Senate have now both passed new Iran sanctions legislation, and I firmly expect strong language to emerge from the Conference Committee before the end of this month. It's important to note that states and local governments have been at the forefront of the Iran sanctions movement for years, highlighted by dramatic successes such as those in my own state of Florida. I was elected to the Florida State Senate in 2006, and recognizing the threat of the Iranian nuclear program, I was determined to use every tool at my disposal to put pressure on the regime. I crafted legislation that would prevent the pension funds of Florida's workers from investing in companies that conduct business within the energy sector of Iran, consistent with the framework established by the Iran Sanctions Act. As the author of the Protecting Florida's Investments Act, I laid out a procedure for identifying and engaging those violating companies who currently invest in the energy sector of Iran above the thresholds in both the state and federal statutes. The Florida State Board of Administration, or SBA, subsequently worked with experts from across the country to develop an effective course of action for divesting the nation's fourth largest pension fund. 3 years later, it is clear that this effort has been a dramatic success. The state of Florida has divested nearly $1.5 billion from 24 companies that do or did business in the Iranian energy sector, including Royal Dutch Shell, Total, ENI, and others. This is $1.5 billion from Florida alone. But no public worker, no retiree from any state or local government, or from any police force, fire department, or school district should see his or her retirement savings invested in Iran's nuclear program. Divestment must be expanded, and most significantly for our collective efforts here today, the companies must be identified. While 19 other states in the District of Columbia have passed similar divestment policies, Florida is the only state to have successfully identified, named, and published on a quarterly basis a list of violating companies, followed by a full and successful divestment from them. Therefore, I would urge Congress to look to Florida as one model for how to identify those companies who are presently doing business in Iran in contravention of international security. Once those companies are identified, immediate economic pressure can be brought to bear at the federal level. Now, SBA identifies potentially violating companies through a thorough and multi-source research effort, which relies on their own analysis, along with independent external research providers. The SBA then sends written notification to any company found to have active business operations with Iran, informing the company that it is now subject to divestment and that it has 90 days to cease such activity. In only a matter of months, Florida published a verifiable and comprehensive list of companies and did so with a small budget and minimal staffing levels. The federal government can easily match and replicate the actions of Florida to create and maintain its own list of violating companies that are presently doing business in Iran. The legislation that emerges from the House-Senate conference must include a requirement that the administration provide a list of all companies that are in current violation of the Iran Sanctions Act. But in advance of these new legislative requirements, the administration should waste no time in creating its own definitive list so that the American people can know immediately which companies are choosing to risk international security by investing in Iran. It would be highly imprudent to waste time by waiting until after the new sanctions law takes effect to compile this important list, when in fact it can be created quickly and easily today. In Florida, this research is done by the pension fund administrators and their outside consultants. I'm aware that the State Department currently has jurisdiction over this area, but it is worth noting that the Energy Department is well positioned to publish such a list, as these are ultimately factual findings, and the Department of Energy has a long track record of publishing similar data within their detailed reports that document energy activity in specified countries, including Iran. If the United States is serious about shining a light on the companies that continually defy U.S. law, we must do everything that we can to simplify this process. The easiest way to gather information is to mandate that companies divulge their business activities in Iran. I would like to commend SEC Chairman Mary Shapiro for her recent comments in support of strengthening the disclosure requirements for companies engaged in such dealings with Iran. It is apparent to a growing number of observers that under U.S. securities law, doing business in Iran should properly be considered a material event that triggers mandated disclosure on SEC filings. Stricter SEC disclosure requirements have also been promoted by Florida's SBA and the not-for-profit group United Against Nuclear Iran, whose president, Ambassador Mark Wallace, circulated a letter recently favoring this new understanding of materiality in the securities law context. I would respectfully ask the members of this committee to join in the call for more complete disclosure requirements. A company's decision to do business in Iran at a time when the United Nations, the European Union, and this Congress are all debating various forms of economic sanctions certainly makes any such Iranian investment material and worthy of full notice to the company's shareholders and to the public. The list of violating companies serves another role. We must cease awarding any government contracts to companies that invest in Iran. My colleague, Congressman Klein, has written tough, important legislation in the House that is included in this comprehensive Iran sanctions package currently in conference committee. As the chairman referred to earlier, the New York Times confirmed over $107 billion of federal government money has been awarded to companies appearing to be in violation of the Iran Sanctions Act since its enactment. Further, as the most recent GAO report states, the federal government spent almost $880 million just in the last 5 years contracting with companies currently doing business in the Iranian energy sector. This is unacceptable, and I am gratified that we are on the verge of passing legislation to ban this practice going forward. Through both Democratic and Republican administrations, the sanctions regime under the Iran Sanctions Act has essentially laid dormant. I am certain that Congress did not repeatedly enact thoughtful and complex Iran sanctions for them never to be used. This practice must end, and it is long past time for these sanctions to be utilized as designed. I'm aware that in the world of international diplomacy, it is not polite to name names. I understand that foreign nations don't want us telling their companies when and where to invest, but the stakes are now too high for diplomatic niceties to trump international security. It is time for our government to name and publish the companies that are investing in Iran. I'm aware that many of those companies are based in countries that are our allies. Nevertheless, there is no greater threat to global security than the Iranian regime's quest for nuclear weapons, and it is time we put proper pressure on our friends, allies, and international competitors alike to end their investments in Iran. The government should be using every power at our disposal to encourage, badger, demand, entice, and sanction companies to remove their business interests from Iran. We're at a crucial moment in history, and time is not on our side. For many years, we waited for diplomacy to take hold and for Iran to forego its nuclear weapons program. Instead, Iran is spinning more centrifuges and announcing the opening of new nuclear facilities, while their president declares his intent to wipe Israel off the map and publicly envisions a world without America. We will have failed if our discussion shifts towards containment and how to deter Iran from using nuclear weapons. Our mission is clear. We must prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. We must act now before it is too late for economic sanctions to deliver genuine results. Florida has shown that it is possible to identify violating companies and to exert real economic pressure. Congress and the administration must now do the same. We can prepare that list today and immediately move ahead with sanctions. We need not and we cannot wait a moment longer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your dedication and commitment to this vital national security interest, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Congressman Deutch, thank you for a very thoughtful, very strong, and ultimately very hopeful statement about what the federal government can and should do. Obviously, we'd love for you to stay for questions, but we'll understand if, in light of the delay, you have to return to the House.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Senator Brown, I agree with you. Senator McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Common sense tells me that what we ought to do is tell every American president that they cannot stand in front of a microphone and talk about sanctions against Iran ever again if they don't begin to take the sanction laws that are on the book more seriously than what this hearing has demonstrated. And this is not the first time we've covered this subject matter. I know that I had the opportunity to talk to General Petraeus about it at a hearing in Armed Services. I know there was a hearing in the Armed Services Committee about this. It is no wonder Iran is so disrespectful. If we cannot get our act together to enforce the laws that are on the books, and passing more laws isn't going to do any good if we don't have the political will to do what we need to do. And I understand the issue of diplomacy, and that part of the problem is that our friends don't want us to enforce, and therefore if we don't enforce against them, then our not so friendly nations say, wait a minute, you didn't enforce against them, so why are you now picking on us? And that's a problem. Let me try to pull back the curtain here. Mr. Christoph, in the GAO report, did your folks that were looking at that, do you all get a sense of the deliberations that are going on in terms of this subject matter? I mean, I'm trying to get a handle on where is it in government that people are sitting around a table and saying, well, we got that law on the books. Should we ignore it? Should we try to enforce it? Is that conversation even going on somewhere? And if so, where?
I think it's starting at State Department. In some of the brief discussions that we had with the new administration and the new members working at the State Department, that discussion is beginning. We did not see any of those discussions when we issued a report in 2007 and had looked at State Department's then enforcement of the Iran Sanctions Act. I would also note that State Department is capable of enforcing other aspects of sanctions against Iran. It has, as we said in our 2007 report, issued sanctions against 111 firms or entities that violated the non-proliferation portion of the collective sanctions against Iran. Many of those companies were Chinese companies, but it has not moved forward on that portion of our collective sanctions that deal with the energy sector.
So they are selectively picking out some parts of the law they like and ignoring the parts of the law they don't like?
Well, I don't want to put those words in their mouth, but by their actions, it appears that it is more difficult for them to impose sanctions on energy companies through ISA.
What about the issue of changing names of companies? I'm a big believer that you've got to have accountability. Who's in charge of investigating whether or not companies are changing their names in order to evade sanctions? Where would the responsibility for that lie?
And that I do not know.
Would you like to take a stab at it, Ms. Pletka? You have been around this subject matter for probably more years than you want to admit.
Yes, that's probably true.
Who in the grand labyrinth of government is supposed to be in charge of even tracking what companies fall under these sanctions, much less enforcing them?
That's an excellent question. In a quarter of a century, I've never been able to figure out who actually wears the chief's hat on this issue. Theoretically, the intelligence community is tracking companies that change their names. Lots of companies don't change their names and are serial violators of our proliferation law and various Iran sanctions, particularly Chinese companies. It is absolutely remarkable that we together have been able to generate an enormous amount of information that is apparently entirely mysterious. And on the energy side, I think that where you have seen a change for the good at the Department of State, in this administration we've seen a change for the bad on the energy side. The Energy Information Agency no longer provides significant amounts of information about companies doing energy business in Iran. And so rather than getting more information, we're getting less.
Mr. Chairman, it seems like maybe what we need to do is start with figuring out who's in charge. I think maybe we've avoided accountability on this because we've not slowed down long enough to figure out who is the person in government that's not doing their job, and as long as we don't identify who that person is, they're not going to do their job. It's mind-boggling to me that we don't know who to yell at. Yes, Congressman Deutch.
Senator McCaskill, I worry that at least with respect to identifying the companies, whether or not to impose sanctions is the next step. But in terms of identifying the companies, I worry that we actually, and I think we've determined here that we've made this a harder task than in fact it may be. In Florida, on a quarterly basis, the pension board publishes a list of companies who are doing business within the energy sector in Iran, and part of that time is spent reviewing exactly this issue of company name changes and subsidiaries and efforts sometimes to shield, sometimes just corporate restructurings to ensure that the correct names remain on that list. I'm not sure ultimately who should have responsibility, but Department of Energy, again, as Danielle points out, has published these reports on a regular basis, factual reports. That might be a place to identify the companies.
Well, welcome to Congress. I think you're going to be a great addition to the intellectual heft of the body in which you serve, and clearly you've got a great work ethic, and we welcome you here. Let me briefly talk about companies that claim to do business with Iran on their websites. There's a company that we've been trying to make accountable. Senator Collins